Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first Elixir Community meetup done by Software Mention. At first, I would like to briefly introduce our company. Our journey with Elixir started around 5 years ago when we started developing our open source multimedia framework called Membrane. And since then, our team has grown significantly. We started doing backends in Elixir, a lot of work with Phoenix. And right now our team is around 30 developers, Elixir developers. And we decided it's a high time to organize such an event for the community. Obviously, this is the first time we're doing this, so we apologize for any mishaps that may happen. And if you have any ideas for next presentations, feel free to contact us. And right now, we'll just go to our first presenter, Jonatan Kłosko, who is the main developer behind Livebook. If you follow José Valim on Twitter, you may have heard of Livebook. Jonatan, the stage is yours.
Hi, thanks for having me. So my name is Jonatan. I work at Dashbit, and for the last year, I've been focused on Livebook. That's what I want to talk to you about today. And so the plan is that I will give some context, just to make sure we're all on the same page on what Livebook is. And then I will go through a number of use cases and kind of showcase what you can do with Livebook. So as you can see, I'm running in the browser, and that's because Livebook is a web application. So we can run it either locally or in the cloud, which we will also do. And Livebook is primarily meant as an application for, or rather as an environment for creating and executing code notebooks. So I will go ahead and create the first one. Yeah, and as usually with documents, we can change the title just to make sure, just to show to the user what notebook's about. And then we already have a section inserted for us. So the section basically groups related content into logical pieces. And the whole notebook is built on top of two primary building blocks. So we have Markdown for describing the code, for kind of describing the concepts that we are about to discuss. Right, and you can see the preview as we type. And then we also have Elixir snippets, where we can pretty much put arbitrary code, and then we can run the code, right? So we immediately see the result of the evaluation, and that's like the basic idea behind notebook systems in general. But the question is, what primary aspects do we want to address with Livebook? And one of the key goals we had from the very beginning is reproducibility. So let's say we define a variable, and so we can evaluate this code. This variable is defined in the memory, and now we have another piece of code that depends on this variable. Right, if we evaluate this code, we see that the code is evaluated sequentially from the top to the bottom, as we would expect. But the key here is if we remove this code, so this variable is no longer defined, or at least it shouldn't be defined, we can clearly see that this cell that depends on it, it's marked as stale, which means the result is no longer up to date. Right, and if we evaluate this code, we can see an error, as we would expect, and that's because we evaluate everything sequentially, right? So that's one of the primary goals we had, because in many notebook systems, the memory is global. So if you define a variable somewhere, it becomes available forever, even if you change the code entirely. Right, so now we can revert this, and if we run this again, everything's green back. So that's the most important point. And then the same applies to dependency management. And for that, we actually use just Elixir features. So like there is nothing Livebook specific about the way we handle dependencies. So let's create a new section and try out to make some HTTP requests. So the function for bringing in dependencies is mix install. It came in Elixir 1.12, and it basically allows you to list the dependencies the same way as you would do in a mix project. So, right, we can try out, for example, REQ. And then once we install the dependencies, we can just use the package as we would expect. And we get the response. So this basically allows for quick code prototyping, because now we can easily change this code and keep re-evaluating to iterate on our prototype, right? And then we can just take this code, put into our actual editor or into our project, and we are done. And you may have noticed that we actually show documentation on Hover. So that's also an important point, that we want to kind of create an immersive experience for the user. So if you are discovering a new package, you can easily discover the API and play around with the library itself. And if we would proceed this notebook, so here we have this document, and what we can do with it once we are done. We could say this notebook, and just to quickly show how it would look like, I'm gonna go to the export section. And as you can see, it's basically Markdown. So all of the code becomes Elixir snippets, and all of the rest is just Markdown by design. So the reason why this is important is that it means the files are readable whenever we share them or do anything else. So I actually have an example here. So just recently, Jose submitted a pull request that basically rewrote a number of guides that come inside Livebook. And as you can see, the changes are pretty clear, and it's like it was very easy to go through the changes and make suggestions, both to the code and to the actual content. So that's like the second point that we wanted to address, to make the notebook easily shareable between people and enable collaboration on review level, basically. Right, and just to reiterate, and going back to the previous example, if we took this notebook and send it to somebody else, because we make the evaluation sequential and predictable, plus we also specify the dependencies by listing the dependencies and diversions, this notebook should be reproducible for somebody else just to run it. So I hope overall this gives you like an idea of what Livebook is in a nutshell. And now I want to go through a couple interesting use cases for Livebook. One feature that I didn't discuss at this point is collaborativeness, but to give it more context, we will try running Livebook in the cloud. So currently, as you can see, we are running locally. But since this is a web application, we can actually run it anywhere. So if you go to the website, in particular, we can see that there are Docker images, which means it's fairly straightforward to run it on any cloud provider. And in particular, Fly.io, that is our partner, they build a custom launcher for Livebook. So basically, you can sign in, put the password, and in like a minute, the application is running. So this is also pretty cool because it allows like people to quickly jump into Elixir and into programming without really installing anything on their machines. And I have an instance running on Fly.io already, and I'm gonna use that to showcase some of the collaborative features we have. So I will start with like an example notebook we have, and I will simulate multiple users by opening a new window. Just give me a second. Yeah, so these are two users at this point, or rather two instantiations of myself. And right, as you can see, as we make changes to the notebook, as we type, the changes are synchronized between the users. And more interestingly, they can see each other all each time. So if I select something here, the other user can see where I am, what I'm editing. And also they can simultaneously type in the editor, and we will synchronize the changes so that in the end they end up with the same state, even if there is like latency in the communication. And one particularly interesting feature is pinning. So if there is another user, we can pin to himself. And then as we move focus on the right, which is the followed user, the other user focus moves basically in the same way. So this makes for a good tool for like pair programming or doing teaching, code interviews, this kind of stuff. And yeah, so basically with this context, you can see that Livebook can be useful for just day-to-day programming and prototyping code, right? Playing around, kind of like in IEX shell you would do, except you have an editor, so you can change things around, move things around, and then eventually persist them. So that's like one group of use cases for Livebook in general. But having all of that, we can ask a question, what kind of content would make sense to put inside notebooks in general? And there is one particular interesting feature in Xdoc that was added recently, and it basically allows for putting notebooks inside documentation and running them. So I have an example package over here, and basically there is this guide section, and usually we can put arbitrary markdown files there as some sort of tutorials for the given library. And in this case, we included some notebooks in the documentation, right? So as you can see, it's all readable. There are code snippets, as you would expect with regular Markdown. But there is also this run in Livebook badge. And what it does is basically it redirects to the Livebook website, and it asks us where we want to import the notebook. So we can go through the preview of the notebook. We can configure the location where our instance is located. So this could be either localhost, this could be the cloud instance that we had. And then if we proceed with that, we can see the notebook imported directly into our environment. So then it's like we can still read the guide and go through it step by step, but we can also actually evaluate all of the code that is in the guide. And this sort of bridges the gap, or rather makes the smooth transition between the user reading examples and reading about the package and actually trying it out and playing around. So it kind of smoothens the curve for getting into the library. And in particular, since we have the documentation integrated inside Livebook, they can easily see what various APIs do without jumping around within the documentation. They can change values, basically play around with the API and kind of immerse themselves in this environment. Yeah, so as in this case, it takes a bit longer, and you can see that there is a timer that shows the computation, which is particularly useful for cases where you're doing like machine learning and training neural nets. So then you can see the timer going on. And yeah, took a bit longer this time actually. And there's another notebook that showcases another new feature. So if you go through the same flow, we open the notebook, and this time we are including Vigolite for plots and Kino for Kino is like a Elixir API for interacting with Livebook within a Livebook. So it allows for rendering interactive widgets and components directly in Livebook. So if we evaluate some of this code, this basically optimizes a function using an evolutionary algorithm. And as a result of this run, a number of metrics is gathered. So then this package provides a function that basically takes the metrics and creates plots over time of those metrics. So if we evaluate that, we can see all of the graphs rendered directly in Livebook. And more than that, they are actually interactive. So you can like zoom in, zoom out. And the best part is that it's not really Livebook specific. If we look at the data structure return, it's just a Vigolite struct, and Vigolite is just a graph representation. You could use this in a Phoenix application, or you can directly export this as a PNG or whatever. And like the way it works is basically we have a protocol inside Kino, and Livebook recognizes that the returned struct, which is a Vigolite plot, is something that we can render in a special manner. So in this case, we use the VigaLite package to render it directly. And there is much more you can do with Kino in general, but we'll hopefully get there as well. Yeah, so that's another thing. And moving forward, as I mentioned, basically one use case is like day-to-day programming. And what we do oftentimes is basically we develop projects like web applications and stuff. So how can we leverage Livebook for exactly that purpose, right? So let's say we have a Phoenix application and we want to interact with that application from Livebook as we would do with like IDXRL, for example. And one way to do that is to go to the runtime, and instead of starting a separate Elixir environment, which is bare bones generally, we can pick the mixed runtime and choose the project that we want to work on. So this will automatically compile the project, get the dependencies, all of that. And having that connected, we can interact with all of the internal modules that we have. So in this case, we get the completion for all of the modules that are a part of the application we are building, right? And we can read the documentation, explore the APIs, and run the code. So the reason this is powerful is because now you can create notebooks specific for the project and the business domain. So you can describe like business concepts and also showcase them via code. So new developers joining the project, they can just go through the series of notebooks and kind of familiarize themselves with the application without really, just jumping around the code base. They can have like a tutorial that literally tells them what this application does, what are the main areas. Yeah, so that's one way of running. And the other way would be like, if this is a Phoenix application, we likely want to start the application itself. And in order to do that, let's go to the project directory. And usually we would do like ix mix, right? And the trick we can do is pass a name. So we start a named node within the mix context. This could be app, we need a cookie, also an app, right? And this would start the Phoenix application. I'm not sure if I missed something, but let me just try. Yeah, I'm not sure why the endpoint isn't running though. But basically, what we could do later on is instead of using the mix runtime, we could attach to the node. So the name we gave to the node, we could pass it here, and we would basically connect to the application, which should give us the same environment. Yeah. I'm not sure why the endpoint isn't running, but let's keep that for now. And going back to the presentation, we saw a number of use cases related to like documenting things, and there is one trick in particular that I really like. So I have this repo where I put all of my notebooks usually, and they are grouped inside a directory. So there's a bunch of them, and I have an index file that is basically like a table of contents for the notebooks. And here you can see the other notebooks are linked relatively. So if we now go and import this main notebook, which we can do through the Radio Livebook badge, we can see this kind of table of contents imported in Livebook. And now if we navigate to a relative URL, we are automatically importing the other notebook directly inside Livebook, which means you can create like multi-chapter books or tutorials, and people can just import a single thing and then go through it by step. Yeah. And since we are here, we can also try out what the notebook does. So we are installing a couple of dependencies. And one thing that, so I mentioned Kino previously, which allows for rendering custom widgets inside Livebook, right? So in this case, we can render like an input box that we can read from later on. And in this case, we are scraping the IMDb website, right? And basically getting data about a movie that we searched for. So if you go to the end, we can see that we downloaded some data by doing web scraping, and then we use Keynote to render it as a markdown, so in a kind of nicer form. And so that's one of the things you could do with Keynote. And another particularly interesting feature is that we mark this cell as re-evaluating automatically, which means that if at any point this result becomes stale, as we change things around, it will automatically evaluate and update itself. So if we change this to another movie, we can see that the code runs automatically, and eventually it should update just this way. So in a way, you can prototype like interactive scripts or be like super fast prototypes. And there are also ideas we have to take this even further and allow you to deploy this notebook as an application, which would hide all of the code and make just, so we would show just the input and the output, and the user could play around with it as if it was an app. So yeah, that's one of the things we could do. And hopefully at this point, this gives you an idea of like 2 areas that Livebook can be leveraged. So like day-to-day programming, prototyping, collaborating, and then creating actual write-ups with interactive code inside them. And yeah, I guess that's it for the use cases that I sort of identified. We also know that some people are using Livebook for like code interviews, for example, and they actually use XUnit to, so they have a bunch of tests with XUnit, and they use Keynote for people to input data, right? And the interviewee is basically meant to like implement a piece of code and make sure that all the tests are passing. So there are many directions that that you could take this.